This is the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Sexual problems are common. In fact, in my own research, I find that about half of adults report having experienced at least one sex problem in the last year alone. What this means is that most of us are probably bound to encounter a problem in the bedroom at some point in our lives. But few of us are prepared when it comes to fixing those problems because it's not something that anyone ever really taught us about before in sex ed. So let's talk about sex problems and how to fix them. In today's episode, we're going to dive into something called the good enough sex model. It's a radically different way of thinking about sex that can help us both in preventing problems from emerging in the first place, as well as fixing problems when they arise. As part of this discussion, we're also going to talk about why it's important to set realistic expectations for resolving bedroom problems, why playfulness is such an important element of good sex, and tips for resolving sexual disagreements. My guest today is Dr. Barry McCarthy. He is an emeritus professor of psychology at American University and a certified couples therapist. He has published more than 150 academic papers and chapters, and he has co-authored or authored 24 books. In 2016, he received the Masters and Johnson Award for lifetime contributions to the sexuality field. So we're speaking with a living legend today. This is going to be another fascinating and very practical conversation. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. If you love the science of sex as much as I do, consider becoming a friend of the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. The Kinsey Institute is the world's premier research organization on sex and relationships, and you can help them continue the legacy of Dr. Alfred Kinsey, whose pioneering research changed everything we think we know about sex. Visit kinseyinstitute.org to make an impact. Your donations can help support ongoing research projects on critical topics. You can also show your support by following Kinsey Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for supporting sex science. Okay, Barry, let's talk about sexual problems and how to fix them. So you've published a lot of research on sexual dysfunction, and in some of your work, you've called attention to an important issue in the way that a lot of sexual problems are treated, which is that they've become overly medicalized. So sex problems are often treated in a one-dimensional way, often with a pill or a medicine that's designed to restore or enhance physical function. But you say in your work that function is a necessary but not sufficient feature when it comes to boosting sexual satisfaction. So I wondered if you could elaborate on this a little bit. So in other words, why do we need more than just pills and potions when it comes to resolving sexual problems and enhancing sexual satisfaction?
In a healthy way, you want to talk about a bio-social model of understanding, assessing, and treating sex problems. Asking the pill to do it all, or asking the injection to do it all, or the pump to do it all, is asking the medicine to do more than it can do. Viagra has probably caused more non-sexual relationships than anything else in history since 1998. It's a good drug. Cialis is actually a better drug for most men. But it's a good drug, but it isn't going to return him to 100% function. We lie to our male clients rather than treat them respectfully and say, what do you need to do to build erectile self-efficacy, psychologically, biomedically, and relationally? I'm not against medical interventions, but they need to be integrated into the man's sexual repertoire and into the couple sexual style. And that's one of the things that really motivates many couples. The idea that they need a new sexual style that integrates three very different components. Intimacy, which is about feeling emotionally close and vulnerable. Pleasure, which is about seeing sex as about enjoying yourself and giving and receiving pleasure-oriented touch. And then the third component is eroticism. And eroticism, far and away, is the most controversial component of male sexuality. There's this notion that says eroticism is all there is to sex. It's like saying the pill is all there is to sex. Erotic fantasies are really important, and accepting your erotic fantasy, but understanding that fantasy is a different dimension in real life couple sexuality. So you want to take an anti-shame approach to this, and you want to take a comprehensive approach to this. But the biggest, I think, insight comes from my deceased colleague, Mike Metz, where Michael developed the concept of good enough sex. What good enough sex means is that sex has multiple roles, multiple meanings, and multiple outcomes. Again, if you think about your sex education or your colleague's sex education, most of the time they have not heard about this idea of multiple roles, meanings, and outcomes. But that's a really important concept that says the best sex is mutual synchronous sex. Both of you have high levels of pleasure. Both of you have high levels of desire. Both of you have high levels of erotic flow or vitality. And both of you feel really satisfied. That's the best kind of sex. But that doesn't happen even the majority of sexual experiences. The majority of sexual experiences they're better for one part than the other. And typically they're better for the man than the woman in young adulthood. But one of the most interesting things with aging is it's often the sexual encounter is better for the woman than the man. But this idea that says we can accept both mutual synchronous sex and we can accept asynchronous sex, which is good, but better for one of you than the other. And we can also accept that anywhere from 1 to 15% of sexual encounters are going to be mediocre, dissatisfying, or dysfunctional. That's normal too. Nobody ever says that to me. They think they're the only person in their community that this has happened to. It's an almost universal phenomenon. You know, one of the things when I was a young psychologist, I got the courage to walk up to Bill Masters at a workshop. I showed him an article that Masters was a wonderful human being, a wonderful researcher, but he was a very critical guy. He said, that's bad science. He threw it in the wastepaper basket. Then he turned to me and he said, do you know how you can be sure a man is cured of erectile dysfunction? It's like God speaking to me as a young clinician. They said, whether it happens once a year, once a month, or once every 10 times, when you don't have an erection sufficient for intercourse and you don't panic, you know you're cured. That is a really golden piece of advice. It's saying enjoy sex, enjoy your sexuality, but don't be demanding of performance. Don't make it a pass-fail test. Sex is not a pass-fail test. It's variable, flexible, with different roles, meanings, and outcomes. I really believe that very strongly.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. You know, we need to recognize that our sexual experiences are going to be variable and that we're not always going to have the amazing, mind-blowing sex that we ideally want to be having, and that, you know, it's going to be a mixed bag. Sometimes it's going to be great. Sometimes it's just going to be okay. Sometimes it's not so good. It's just like when you go out for dinner, right? Sometimes you're going to have a great meal. Sometimes it's going to be just okay. And other times it's going to be terrible, right? You never know what you're going to get. So yeah, I think that 85% approach is really a valuable way of kind of looking at it and thinking about this, is that, you know, most of the time it's going to be pretty good. It's not always going to be perfect. Our body isn't always going to do what we want it to do. Things might go wrong, unplanned, unexpected things might happen, and that's okay. You know, we just have to accept and be okay with the fact that sex won't always be perfect.
You know what's really a life-changing experience for clients? When they have a sexual encounter where they're orgasmic, but their partner is not orgasmic, but the partner is more satisfied with their encounter than you are. That really does bring home the reality that sex, I love orgasm. For men, women, couples, I love orgasm. But orgasm is not the best measure of satisfaction. It's feeling good about yourself as a sexual man, and it's feeling more bonded and more energized as a sexual couple. That's what sex is about.
And, you know, that's where I think we sometimes go wrong when we're talking about something like the orgasm gap, where it seems like the goal is we want to have orgasm equality. And as long as everybody's orgasming all the time, like all our sexual problems are solved. But Orgasm, like you said, is not necessarily the best metric of whether or not people are enjoying sex and whether they're sexually satisfied. Yes, orgasms are great when they happen, but they don't have to happen in order to have an enjoyable sexual experience. And the more that we put pressure on ourselves and put pressure on our partners to have orgasms, the more that that can start to detract from the sexual experience, because then sex becomes this performative thing that we're doing where we have this goal that we're trying to achieve. And whenever we're trying to achieve goals during sex, that often gets in the way of experiencing pleasure.
Like performance is anti-pleasure. And when especially couples where one partner is working, they're working against their body, so they have an orgasm to please the other person. That does not enhance desire. In fact, it kills desire. Or the performance orientation is really bad for desire. The pleasure orientation is much healthier for desire. And, that's been said for women in terms of the work of Emily Nagoski, but it's also very true of men. This idea that you're going to feminize masculinity is nonsense. What you do is you make it more complex, you make it more personally acceptable, and you give yourself more options to really feel good about yourself as a sexual person.
Yep, absolutely. Now, a key part of the good enough sex model is the idea that it is essential to set realistic, age appropriate sexual expectations in order to experience sexual satisfaction. And I think that's such an important point for dealing with any sex problem, because all too often, I think people have a tendency to make overly optimistic expectations for how things are going to be resolved. So, for example, in the case of a desire discrepancy, the higher desire partner might have it in their mind that the end goal is for them and their partner to have sex every day or every other day.
Or more frequently, no matter what.
Right. But that might not even be in the realm of possibilities. So tell us a little bit about the importance of having realistic expectations. And can you give us some examples of what a realistic expectation might look like?
For me, the realistic expectation is that 85 to 95% of the time, an encounter is going to be worthwhile and positive. And that includes erections, intercourse, and orgasm. But it doesn't depend on erections, intercourse, and orgasm. It also says, I'm going to turn toward my partner, whether it's the best sex in our history or it was a real bomb. I'm not going to apologize. I'm not going to panic. I'm not going to go away. It's also important to have the sense that sexuality belongs to you no matter how it plays out. And that setting unrealistic performance goals, especially about frequency, sets up power struggles with couples. I'm an old clinician. I trained a long time ago where the goal was the most common sexual problem back then was premature ejaculation. Now the most common sexual problem in 2024 is discrepancies in sexual desire. And a third of the time, that is the male with low desire. But most of the time, it's the female with low desire. What we used to believe is that the cure was to increase frequency. Nobody who I like and trust or respect anymore believes that. What we believe is that the way to think about discrepancies in sexual desire is as a couple issue. And we say to our partner that your feelings and needs, you have a right to veto, and I'll respect your veto, but you don't have a right to avoid. So what we want to do is we want to expand our understanding of what sexuality is. Most couples only have two gears. They have affection, they have intercourse. One of the things I want them to learn is they have to adopt ideally 5 gears of touch, but at least 3. And 4 of those 5 gears are sexual. So sensual touch, playful touch, and erotic non-intercourse touch are all ways of being sexual. And what positive realistic expectation is not about intercourse. It is about connection. It is about having positive connecting experiences. And the goal, the hope of that was that would occur at least every other week, and ideally would be more true 1 or 3 times a week. Don't set a performance goal, but do use as a guideline the importance of staying connected. And the biggest specific guideline is when you have a negative experience, own it, make a joke of it if you want, but basically say, that's not going to control me. What's going to control me is I want to be connected to you and share pleasure with you. That's the expectation. I try when I work clinically to not terminate with the client until they've had a negative experience. I want them to have confidence that they can respond to a negative experience in a healthy way. That really does matter a pretty deal.
Yeah, and I agree with everything that you said there. And I want to pick up on one thing that you said where you talked about how maybe you can make a joke of it, right? And I think that ties in with another key aspect of your good enough sex model, which is that one of the keys to good sex is having a certain amount of playfulness in it. And the idea of playfulness is something that I find is not often present in media depictions of sex and also not present in a lot of porn either. The sex is just so serious and so mechanical. And I think it reinforces the idea that sex is just about the physical interaction. But just thinking about my own personal experiences, the best ones always have some element of play in them, where there was some laughter or some fun. And I think the reason for that is because it takes all the pressure off. It just lets you feel more relaxed. So tell us a bit more about why you think playfulness is such an important element of good sex.
I think that third gear, the playful gear, is probably the most underutilized gear. And the way we try to do that is we put a temporary prohibition on intercourse and a temporary prohibition on orgasm. But we don't put a prohibition at all. In fact, we encourage them to try to find what is their sensual, playful voice. And playful in my language, so think about arousal on a 10-point scale. 0 is neutral, 10 is orgasm. Playful touch basically takes you from 3 to 6 on that scale. It's not going to go to orgasm. It's not going to go to intercourse, but it's going to be fun. And one of the things I encourage people to experiment with is, are they multiple stimulators, which is a majority, or are they single stimulators? It isn't one is right and one is wrong. But there's some people who like doing one thing at a time, and there's other people who multitask. What is playful for you? What is enjoyable for you? What engages you? The other thing that really is important is there's many people who like the idea of giving and receiving at the same time, partner interaction arousal. And there's other people who say, how can you do that? That's so silly. I want to be either receiver or giver. I want to take turns. But when you're the giver in terms of playful touch, don't try to second guess your partner. What is playful for you? What do you enjoy giving? Hopefully the partner will enjoy receiving it. But the biggest thing is, don't try to second guess your partner. Play for yourself and engage your partner in your play.
Yeah, I think that's all great advice. And I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned a little bit earlier. You talked about how the most common sexual problem that sex therapists see seems to have changed somewhat over time, where it used to be premature ejaculation and now it's desire discrepancies. And, I hear from sex therapists I have on the show all the time that desire discrepancies are the single most common thing that they deal with. But I'm curious if you had any insight into maybe what changed or why desire discrepancies now suddenly seem to be so common.
I got my PhD way back in 1969. What I learned in 1969 about sex, that was the year before Masters and Johnson's published Human Sexual Inadequacy, was that as long as you had arousal and orgasm, everything was going to be fine. I have great respect. They are the grandparents of the field, but they missed the core issue, which is desire. And the core issue is not spontaneous desire. It is responsive desire, not just for women, but for men and for couples. That's a big, big dramatic change. And one of the things about responsive desire is you've got to identify your bridges to desire, individually as a couple, biomedically, psychologically, relationally. And we make so many mistakes. We go from one extreme to another. So the old extreme is the extreme of performance. The new extreme is the extreme of intimacy. The idea that the more intimacy, the better. That's not true. The issue becomes how you balance three very, very different phenomena. Intimacy is 1, pleasure is 2, eroticism or vital sexuality is 3. Those are very different phenomena. But that's what you want to do in a healthy sexuality if you're going to maintain it. And you want to not give in to the myth that say, well, as long as I have ejaculatory control and you have an orgasm, everything is fine. It's not true. It sounds like it should be true, but it's not. But the key element is a sense of physical and emotional connection. The sense that you want to be able to look forward to being sexual the same way you look forward to going to your favorite restaurant, your favorite musical venue. Sexual desire is all about anticipation and a sense of deserving of pleasure. So I think when we go from one extreme to another, we mislead our clients and basically lie to them. My biggest problem with the pro-erection medication is that we lied to the man. We said to him, if you take this medication, you will go back to predictable erection. It's not true. That you've got to understand the role and meaning of sexuality and accept the range of outcomes.
Yeah, I think those are all such important points. And, what you said about Masters and Johnson, I think is something that's worth talking about a little bit, which is that, they did certainly very important work in the field of sex research and in sex therapy, but I think they got some things wrong along the way. And, one of them is the idea that male sexual response is kind of inherently simple. The way that they plot it out and describe it is that there's just one sexual response pattern for men, whereas for women, it's highly variable. And what we've seen in recent years with additional research is that men's sexual response can be variable too.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think it's just an under-recognized, underappreciated point because for decades, a lot of Masters and Johnson work has kind of been taken as the, kind of gospel of the field and hasn't been questioned or challenged, but they did get some things wrong along the way. And I think, something else that is important to recognize here is that they studied sex in this very clinical way, and they didn't look at desire and intimacy and all of these other things that are core aspects of good sex. Their work is valuable for understanding the physiology of sex, but not so much the psychological components of it.
Well, I think their biggest single mistake in terms of males was to put the old way of being sexual, the adolescent young adult, as the right way to be sexual for men, women, and couples. And their second big one was to misunderstand the role of positive anticipation and desire. But again, they were the grandparents of the field. Grandparents make mistakes. We need to not beat up on them, but rather take in this new approach. And they were right also about sensate focus. Is very, very helpful. But sensate focus alone is not enough. A lot of people don't like the word eroticism. There's a new movement in the sex field, and that is to talk about it as vital sexuality. Eroticism has too much of the connotation of the male model, too much of the connotation of porn, too much of the connotation that says if you fantasize about something, it means you want to do it. So I hate to be politically correct, but they might be right that eroticism is not the best term. Vital sexuality is probably a better term. But this idea that there is a sexual force, and I think the thing that Masters and Johnson did the best for the field is they took a pro-sexuality stance. And that field that has continued throughout what they need to emphasize now is the acceptance of the variety and meanings of sexuality. So we took a giant step forward in terms of gay folks. We've taken a giant step forward with kink and different kind of arousal. I call it mainstream sexuality versus alternative sexuality. Both mainstream and alternative sexuality people deserve first-class sexuality and first-class clinical treatment.
I agree. And it would be nice if we could all get first class treatment in terms of how we're approaching things sexually. Well, it has been a pleasure to have you here, Barry, and to learn all about the Good Enough Sex model. Is there anything else you want us to know about Good Enough Sex?
I think the biggest thing to know about Good Enough Sex is you're better off adapting it earlier in your life rather than waiting until your 50s and 60s. You'll have a better sexual relationship, more balanced sexual relationship in your 20s, 30s, 40s, if you don't have to wait until your 50s and 60s when there's a big problem. Primary prevention is a wonderful way of going. And again, I think the name of the game, when I tell my couples, is do you have a couple sexual style that balances intimacy, pleasure, and eroticism? And if you do, you're much better off than the great majority of your peers.
That is all so true. So thank you again so much for your time, Barry. It was a pleasure to have you here.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.